to laying his brother to rest at a funeral which was broadcast across America and around the world. This moment falls amidst all systems failing America's black community. The coronavirus pandemic rises and even spikes in 19 states, and blacks are disproportionately affected when it comes to infections and deaths, and also the loss of their jobs. When it comes to voting, yesterday's chaotic primary in Georgia provides yet another window into the issues facing minority voters. There, they had to wait for hours in line. Available ballots weren't there for them. So at this important moment in history, I am joined by Mary Frances Berry, a lifelong activist and academic, and she was once former chairwoman of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Welcome to the program, Mary Frances Berry. I just want to ask you first, what you have written and you have lived a life of protest and resistance and resolution and solutions to many of the ills. What you have written about is prolonged protest. Tell me how that fits in what we're seeing now on the streets and how protest can shape politics as we go forward in this moment.
Well, what I've discovered and acted on and written about is that protest has to be persistent. What I worry about at this moment, and most of the campaigns that I've been involved in and written about took a time to bear fruit. What I worry about at this moment is that once the mourning for the particular Mr. Floyd is over, and at some point it will be, and depending on what course the virus takes, and depending on what the imperatives of electoral politics are, and campaigning and all that sort of thing, how long will the protests last? There will be an inclination on the part of political officials to, once they pass some police reform measures, which will probably be insufficient in my view, they will go on to something else and say that if you want more done, then go out and vote and, campaign and all that. Voting is important. But you must have protests. It's an essential ingredient of politics. And it must be of a longer duration than a week or 2 weeks or a month. And the virus may not permit it, depending on whether it gets out of hand again.
So let me ask you about that, because clearly I think everybody understands that if it wasn't for the protest, this reaction across the United States, across the world, probably wouldn't have unfolded either.
Right.
And that you see right now, whether it's some Republicans, certainly the Democrats in Congress, you see across states where it's elected leaders in cities and towns across America who are saying the right thing, a lot of them, and wanting to push the ball forward. How do you get the message, and who do you need to get the message to keep up that pressure?
Well, I think the Black Lives Matter people who have been talking in public have said that they understand the need to do that. You see, every time we've had a disturbance after some Black people have been killed or something happened, or racial unrest and disturbance, we've had a report. And the report, whether it was Kerner Commission or other kinds of reports after Martin Luther King was assassinated and so on, usually tell us the things we need to do. One is to reform the police, which we're talking about right now, because this whole thing was so graphic and so stark. And the other is that we should pass programs, social programs for poor people, and do something about inequality in the country. In addition, if we don't want the same thing to keep happening over and over and over again, that part of the message has unfortunately usually been lost, although the police reform message has been out there. This time, we talk about defunding the police, which is shorthand for taking some of the money from the police budget to do some of the things that the reports all tell us we must do. I don't know about that message, because it can be compromised in its iteration, with all sides arguing that you're attacking the police or not attacking the police. But the point is that if we don't do the hard things, if we don't do them and do them right, not that police reform isn't difficult, but it's much harder to do something about inequality, then we will be back here again over and over and over again. And I've seen this movie several times before.
So I'm going to ask you another question about the inequality piece of this because it obviously is fundamental. And then I want to ask you for the movie that you've seen before so that you can give us your historical take on it because that's important. First of all, as you know, it has been declared by the American Medical Association and the American College of Physicians that racism is a public health issue. Police brutality as well. Psychological and physical trauma that Black communities experience really leads to chronic stress, illness, financial burden on the community and on the healthcare system. But I want to ask you about how to equalize the economic playing field and the opportunities, because as you also know, when the power structure is asked to level the playing field, they then sort of cry foul. They say, oh no, this is a backlash against us. They don't want to see their historic privilege being leveled. And I wonder how that movement can happen, how you can structurally change, which will inevitably, or maybe not, I want to know your opinion on this, lead to some of that privilege taking out of white pockets and going into Black and minority pockets. How does that happen?
If the people who have been protesting, who are a diverse group racially, white people, Black people, people of all races out there, not just Black people, if those people who are well-meaning and who are serious about what they're doing, if they continue to lean on public officials and say things, it doesn't take an exorbitant amount of resources or attention, that we want to do something about the jobs gap, where right now the economy is suffering for everyone, but routinely it suffers for Black folk, and including young Black people in our communities who are perennially out of jobs. Do something about infrastructure, hire them, give them some kind of leg up with these programs. Do something about the K through 12 education system, which is profoundly unequal by everyone's account. Do something about healthcare and make it affordable, give it for free to people who can't access it. If you sit down and you think about the wealth gap and you think about the resource gap and you think about those things, there are possibilities if we can get this same coalition that's talking about police reform and talking about how awful it was what happened to George Floyd, if they can even push their legislators to do something more. That's all I'm asking for.
And public opinion, as I said, is really shifting in that direction. A vast majority of the American people sympathize with the protests against what happened to George Floyd, and they don't sympathize with the way, some of the police response has been, as you know. So it is an important moment here that pollsters say is pretty unprecedented in American public opinion, the way it's shifted so fast. But so I want to ask you, because we've seen...
Christiane, if I may interrupt you, I think that it is important to say that people say they want police reform, but we know when we've gotten police reforms before, they haven't been implemented, okay? And that the police have gone on with the same way they've been before. And also, what I'm talking about is harder than making different rules about what the police should do and ought to do. They are the on the surface problem. Underneath, you have all of these other problems of race discrimination and inequality and poverty and all the rest of them, which will will continue to put us on edge. George Floyd was a man, a working class type man. He wasn't Martin Luther King or Emmett Till or any of these people who are historic figures in the civil rights movement. He was an ordinary Black guy. If Black guys like him can't have opportunity, so that they're not, if he indeed had a forged $20 bill or whatever it was, I don't know if he did or not, but if he did, if he's in those economic circumstances, we want a society in which ordinary Black guys can have jobs where they can work, where they won't be discriminated against, and in addition, they don't have to suffer police abuse. So I'm talking about that whole picture, which may be pie in the sky and may never happen, but that's what I want to see this movement bring to us.
Okay, so that's really upsetting to hear you say it may never happen because it's obvious to everybody how unbelievably unjust and unfair this is. Anybody with a soul, a heart, eyes, ears, who's been not just living these last 2 weeks, but historically. So I want to ask you because you raise a very significant point. Obviously, you do, and that is that even since the time of Martin Luther King, who you mentioned, you know his fundamental message also was about economic opportunity. And we've seen Charles Blow of the New York Times write an op-ed basically saying, white people, please don't fail us again, referring
Right.
to the Summer of Freedom when hundreds of white people, well-meaning, went down to the South, helped protest, help, move along the Civil Rights Act, etc. And then when it came to expanding that to the North, they were basically nowhere to be seen. So this is what Martin Luther King wrote after that period of time. He said in 1967, "I'm convinced that many of the very people who supported us in the struggle in the South are not willing to go all the way now. I came to see this in a very difficult and painful way. In Chicago, the last year where I lived and worked, some of the people who came quickly to march with us in Selma and Birmingham weren't active around Chicago." So I guess my question to you is, okay, that's a historical fact. How important is it for Black Lives Matter and the Black community on the street and the supporters they have to also have, a huge tipping point of of the power structure on their side, white privilege on their side?
It is absolutely essential that they have those white people who are going out help protesting, who are at the protests, who are out on the streets all around the world and in this country. It is absolutely essential that they do what Martin Luther King said they would not do at the time that he was speaking, and which is why he had the Poor People's March. Is one of the things that happened, which is when he was assassinated. Okay. So he could lead it. Couldn't lead the Poor People's March because he saw that the inequality that dragged Black people down and they kept us down since the end of slavery was in fact being perpetuated, and well-meaning people who had been with us when we were talking about passing civil rights laws, we were talking about the nasty people, we called them in the South, who were killing people and all that. But when it came to having to give up something they thought, or that we were going too far, they weren't with us. What I'm hoping this time is that all of those people who are with us on this police issue will stay with us on the issue of reducing inequality, and that our movement will continue until the public begins to see why it's necessary to take some of the other measures that we're talking about to improve the lives of Black people like George Floyd and other Black people who are ordinary people trying to lead ordinary lives.
And finally, you talked about voting being important. So question to you obviously is, does Joe Biden have it? Does he have what it takes to get Black Americans to vote for him? We understand he got, a good amount of votes, obviously, from a certain older demographic, but not the younger demographic. And they look back to the 90s and the criminal bill, the welfare bill, all of that stuff. What does he have to do, if anything, to win their trust, win the trust of a people who basically, as you said, we vote and they do nothing for us?
If Joe Biden became the tribune of reducing inequality, doing something about the gap, the jobs gap, the housing gap, the education gap, all those gaps that are perpetuated in the Black community, if he took up the message of the Poor People's March and all the people since, and he became the leader of that, in the vanguard of it, he would have young Black folks running out like crazy, trying to vote for him. But it's not enough to just say, we want to dump Trump, and if you want to get rid of Trump, vote for me. Because people want to know, what is it you're going to do? What are you going to do? And if you're not going to do anything, it's going to be very hard to get them to come out, in my opinion.
Mary Frances Berry, thank you very much. And we're going to continue that